We're busy talking about topics that came or related to the talk that Matt gave on the substantive view about the image of God. And so, we're just going to be taking a look at a few of them. The first one we're going to be talking about is wisdom and its role in the early chapters of Genesis. So Matt, why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Cool, yeah. So in the opening chapters of Genesis, we saw from chapter 1 that humans are made in God's image. We saw that they're unlike the other animals in that they are God's image bearers. And we said in the lesson that this comes down to our capacity for rationality. And I think the second major section of the creation account, in looking at Genesis 2-3, we see that thesis sort of vindicated. So in Genesis 2, we have we meet the humans, and what they're told right in the beginning is that God created the tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, and the humans were told not to eat from it. And on the day that they do eat of it, they'll die. The question is, what is that knowledge? What is the knowledge that the tree is? What is the knowledge of good and evil that the tree is for, or that the tree gives? There have been a bunch of different suggestions that it's an ethical category, that it's not so much what we know as in kind of cognitive capacities, but that it has to do with deciding for ourselves what right and wrong is. There have been others who disagree with that, who say, no, it is actually talking about cognitive capacities. What is it? That's the big question. In Genesis 3, we see it play a big role. So that's what we want to talk about. And toward the end of Genesis 3, we see that this is actually something that's, in fact, throughout Genesis 3, we see that this is something that's linked up with being like God. It's what the serpent says about the tree, that, go ahead, eat it. God just doesn't want you to, because he doesn't want you to be like him. So we want to think a bit more about that.
It's interesting, actually, that the serpent frames it like that, because, in Genesis 1, you're told that the humans are made in his image and his likeness. So clearly God does want them to be like him in some sense. I mean, not exactly like him, obviously, because they're created and he's not, but there is definitely a strong sense in which, out of all the creation, it's the humans that he wants to be like him. It
is interesting that the serpent is also sort of in a class different from the other creatures, or at least comparatively a step up from the other creatures. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that the Lord God had made. And that word, crafty or shrewd, it's the Hebrew word arum. It plays a big role in the so-called wisdom books of the Bible, particularly the book of Proverbs, which talks about shrewdness. But it never says that he's made in God's image, and it doesn't talk so much about the serpent's knowledge, I guess. I think what we see with the serpent is that he wasn't actually wrong. He says to the humans, God just says that you mustn't eat that because then you will be like God, knowing good and bad, knowing good and evil. And toward the end of the narrative, in verse 22, the Lord God said, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil." That's what happened from eating the fruit. So clearly the serpent was right. There's something about eating this fruit that makes them like God. It's that knowledge of good and evil that makes them like God in some sense. So, I mean, that's weird.
I wanted to just stop there for a second, because you just said the man. My Bible also says that, but it would have been both the man and the woman, right? Because they both ate from the not the Garden of Eden, the tree.
Yeah. So I was reading from an NIV. It says the man has now become like one of us. The word is Adam, which is the Hebrew word that can mean man, but usually it actually means the more generic term humanity. It's more the catch-all term, the category, rather than the man as an individual. So actually, I think probably a better translation would be that humans have become like one of us, in that they know good and bad. It applies to the woman as well. We can't just single out the man here. Actually, both of them have the fruit, and both of them have this knowledge that makes them like God in some sense. I think
so. Then, go for it.
No, I think that's an interesting thing, because they become like God once they've eaten the fruit that God told them not to, which seems a little bit weird. If that kind of seems to work against what we've been saying, that God created them in His image, and He created them good, in fact, very good by the end of day 6. And here we're seeing, well, now they have become like God after doing the thing that He told them not to. So that's weird.
Yeah, is it saying something like wisdom or knowledge is like the cause of the fall, or it's connected to sin intrinsically in some way, or it like goes against our nature? I guess, that would almost be the opposite of what we were saying.
I think it would be exactly the opposite. And I think what it comes down to is just thinking a little bit about what we mean by that knowledge. What does it mean when it talks about the knowledge of good and bad? And like I mentioned, scholars have had a variety of views on what that means. Is this an ethical category? Is this an ethical redefining, deciding for ourselves what right and wrong is? Is it, what is it? And the scholar I found most helpful has been John Walton. He says that no, this does actually have to do with knowledge. We can't reduce it to just an ethical decision. It does have to do with knowledge, and that knowledge isn't a bad thing. It isn't something wrong with humans. It isn't something that is characterized by or gives character to sin. It's something that God actually wanted to cultivate in the humans Himself, in His own time, in His own way, and for that wisdom to be the way that God helps the humans to govern His creation well, which is actually something that we're going to think a little bit more about in the coming weeks. It's something that God wanted to do His own way. And what the humans were doing, what they actually did wrong here, and what arguably is what was sinful about what they're doing, is taking it in their own time. They were told not to take from that tree. And what that was a grasping for the wisdom that actually God wanted to cultivate more gradually. They were saying, no, actually, I don't want to wait for this. Let me take it now. So
then the problem wasn't so much what they were gaining, but how they were gaining it. They were taking like a shortcut or something, and that was the problem?
Yeah, it seems like it. And in doing so, knowledge in and of itself, or wisdom in and of itself, could actually go either way. It could be something that we use to glorify God. It's a feature of humanity that can be used to serve Him and worship Him and to love Him and to live the way that He wants us to. But it could also be twisted our own way. It could also be pushed in our own direction to serve our own end, to create our own sorts of kingdoms. I think we see this with Solomon, to be honest. That here's somebody who has wisdom from God, and goes and builds a very impressive kingdom. But when you read 1 Kings in light of Deuteronomy, particularly Deuteronomy 17, which gives us a picture of what the kings were supposed to look like, what they were supposed to be characterized by, we see the exact opposite. Solomon created and fashioned for himself a kingdom on wisdom, and a very impressive kingdom, a very well-functioning kingdom, a very successful kingdom, but not a very Yahweh-shaped kingdom, not a very covenant-centered kingdom. And that was a problem. And I think there's a similar sort of dynamic that's going on here. It's not that wisdom is a bad thing in and of itself, but when we twist it to our own ends, that becomes a problem.
So I was going to ask how that relates. So because we didn't really mention wisdom in the talk at all. We spoke about it in terms of the philosophical categories that we're familiar with. So rationality, reason, those sorts of things. So how does this biblical idea of wisdom then connect to the more philosophically framed language that we were using in the talk?
Yeah, so I think Walton here is helpful. that wisdom is a cognitive faculty. It's a cognitive feature. It's about knowing. It's a sort of perception of the world. I think if I remember right, Aquinas actually thinks that wisdom is being able to identify something's fundamental causes and know how to see how things work in at their most fundamental level. But while it's certainly not less than rational, although it's certainly not less than intellectual, I think Walton does actually stop short, and I do think it is actually more. There's some of this that we actually spoke about. In fact, quite a lot of this that we spoke about in our module on practical theology, our module called The Good Life. In lesson 1, we thought about what wisdom is. And we have what we said characterizes the image of God, that it's our intellective capacities, it's that we're rational animals, but it's also that it's also what flows from that we're moral beings. So there's actually a quote from Tremper Longman, who the way that he defines wisdom is, I think, quite helpful. Wisdom is the skill of living. It is a practical knowledge. There we go, practical knowledge. So again, it's knowledge, but it's a practical knowledge that helps one to know how to act and how to speak in different situations. Wisdom entails the ability to avoid problems and the skill to handle them when they present themselves. Wisdom also includes the ability to interpret other people's speech and writing in order to react correctly to what they're saying to us, end quote. So I think that's the touch point, that wisdom is, it's more than that. It's more than intellectual. It also includes a sort of moral dimension to it and is a practical knowledge, but it is knowledge. And it is, for that reason, something about what characterizes us as intellectual beings, as God's image bearers.
Yeah, I've heard wisdom defined, I think, as right reason applied to action or something like that. So it's like you know the right thing, but you know it's more than just knowing how to act or how things are. It's about like being able to actually exercise that knowledge in action, because you can often know the right thing. Like you can know that when you're having a contentious debate with a friend of yours or something, that you shouldn't get like overly aggressive in the way that you respond to them. But then in the actual moment, it's one thing knowing that. It's another thing to like be in the moment and be caught up in it, and then be able to like stop yourself from doing it. And that's the difference between like knowledge, which is just right reason, and wisdom, which is right reason being applicable in action.
Proverbs has a lot to say about people being able to control their tongue.
Yeah, right, yeah. Or James, like be slow to speak.
Yeah.
Not quick to anger.
Yeah.
Slow to speak, slow to anger, quick to listen or something, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then it would be something like the rationality that we were talking about in the talk is the power that is involved in the exercise of wisdom. And since the other animals aren't imbued with that as part of their nature, that rationality, we wouldn't really be able to say that they're wise or have wisdom. We could say things like what could we say, I guess? I mean, they do some smart things sometimes.
Yeah, and the snake is called shrewd, but
shrewd.
It's not quite the same. It's not quite the same thing.
So then would that be one of the... I mean, yeah, as far as I know, the biblical authors don't really ascribe wisdom to animals. They would presumably take that to be one of the distinguishing features of humans, and it is certainly something that's attributed to God, so it seems to be a natural... It could almost be like the biblical way of talking about what we were talking about as rationality. They're like kind of... Not they are the same, but they like are getting at the same idea.
Yeah. I think, it's interesting you say that about the animals. There are a couple examples, like in Proverbs, say that I don't remember if it actually says that ants are wise, but it portrays ants as wise because of how they're hardworking. And what we're meant to see there is not that, oh look, ants also have this cognitive capacity that humans also do, and so they must also. It's none of that. What it's doing is inviting us to look at the ants and say, well, look at this admirable thing about them. Why don't you embody that as well? That would be really wise for a human to do. And I think we can possibly see the same sort of parallel between us and God, that that we reflect God in an important way in that we're wise, in the intellective capacities that He's given us, in the fact that we're rational animals. But the way that God is actually, it's a few steps away from that. We're not the same. God isn't just another being like humans that also acts rationally. He's analogically rational. And if you want to learn more about that, then I'd recommend you look at the first lesson from our series, Know Thy Maker, which is where we think about analogy. Or in fact, I think it might be lesson 4 of that module. I think we spoke about it under divine simplicity.
Yeah, divine simplicity. Yeah, I was going to say.